Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our 5th webinar of our summer series, I.T.E.A.C.H, where we are talking about education, assessment, and current happenings in today's education market. My name is Allison Boyven, and I am on the marketing team here at Riverside Insights, and I will be your host for today's webinar alongside another former educator, Rita Linneman. She is the product manager for several of our achievement assessments. Last week, we heard from the principal of St. Michael's Catholic School in Cuero, Texas, about structures and strategies in place for analyzing assessment data, training teachers, and looking at assessment data, and how data supports program and instructional decisions, and ways to build a positive data culture among staff. Well, today, we are really excited to welcome back Dr. T.E.A.C.H Welch to share with us how COVID has impacted longitudinal growth with student achievement, how to best interpret student growth scores and understand the rate at which students are learning, and how we can create growth goals for individual students and cohorts and make program and instructional decisions based on the longitudinal data. But before we get started and introduce today's speaker, we have a few announcements to share. Throughout this summer, we have been and are presenting webinars on various education topics, including PLCs and data meetings, building a positive testing culture, and how assessment data does drive that instruction. We have just a few more webinars left for the summer, so be sure to join us for the remaining sessions as educators share their thoughts and perspectives on the given topic, and look for our weekly webinar invites. And during today's session, you may have questions that you would like our speaker to answer, and we certainly welcome those questions. Please type those into the Q&A panel, which is on the right side of your screen. It will look something like this image shown here. And we will be sure to share your questions as the topic arises during today's discussion. There are also a few handouts included with today's session, and those are located under the handouts triangle in the right side panel. So be sure to download those during today's webinar. Also, today's session is being recorded, and you will receive the recording, a copy of the slides, the handouts, and a certificate of attendance in the next day or two. So be on the lookout for that in your inbox. Also, recordings of all of our previous webinars can be found at our website at info.riversideinsights.com/K12PD. Opening this page provides you with this header shown here, and last week's webinar is included on that page. And now on to today's presentation and discussion. We are thrilled to have with us once again Dr. T.E.A.C.H Welch. She's one of our 2 authors of the Iowa Assessments and Iowa Flex. So I'm going to pass it over to her to introduce herself before we get going.
Thanks, Allison. It's a privilege to be here. Appreciate the opportunity to talk about measurement. As Allison said, I'm in the College of Education at the University of Iowa and have the privilege of working with teachers and graduate students that are interested in assessment and finding information in assessments that is of value to them. So nice to be back. Thank you.
Absolutely. And it's always a privilege to have you on a webinar with us, talking about your research and insights and the practical applications at the local level to help students grow in their learning. And we thank all of you, district and building administrators and teachers who are joining us today on this webinar. When we think about longitudinal growth among cohorts and specific students, is those scores and understanding that rate of growth where many of us have a lot of questions. And how do we interpret those scores, and what information do we need from previous or future assessments to determine the growth, and what kinds of decisions can be made from looking at the scores? And also, what are some trends with how quickly students are recovering from COVID? What are some realistic goals we can begin to create from the data? So I know we're going to dig into some answers to these questions today. So I'll go ahead and pass it over to you, T.E.A.C.H, to get us started.
Thank you, Allison. As Allison has said, we're going to try to talk about the scores that show growth, those that help us really fill in the gaps around instructional decision making, knowing that they're going to be complemented by many other things that you have in your toolbox locally. and to better understand what it means to be measuring longitudinal growth, both for groups as well as individual students. And they have different sort of attributes when you think about them as individual students and goal setting versus groups. And I know with us today, there's people that are interested in both levels of the audience. So we'll try to touch upon those. I also wanted to reference back to a session that we gave, my colleague Steve Dunbar and I gave on June 20th that had to do with the metrics that again measure change. And so some of this will be a little bit of a repeat as we sort of lay that foundation again, and then hopefully go beyond that with specific examples that help fill in some of those gaps. So with that in mind, I think we'll do a quick sort of return to the metrics again. So the next slide shows us there are particular metrics that measure growth. Not every metric is designed to measure growth by any means. And depending on what you want to do locally, you want to select the measure and the metric that meets your needs locally. Sometimes districts and dioceses gravitate towards one metric or the other, and that's great, just so you understand sort of the attributes, the positive attributes, as well as the limitations of some of these metrics. So the next slide highlights the three that we will see come up on the various slides today. The standard score, which is a metric in and of itself that is tied to achievement across a continuum. It is a metric just like any other test that you may give locally. It has its own attributes. It's defined to measure things on the Iowa assessment. And then as we went into the development of the Iowa Flex, we maintained that same standard score metric to allow us to put these two assessments together on the same scale. National percentile rank, I think we all know what that means. And perhaps of all the metrics, it's the one that families tend to gravitate towards. In so many ways, it's just more intuitive. And then a related metric to that is the grade equivalent that some dioceses, some districts continue to use. And the next slide sort of shows the relationship between these three. Remember that, as I mentioned before, that raw score is really the observed score we get, whether it be a fixed form like the Iowa assessments, or whether it be an adaptive form like the Iowa Flex. We're walking away with something we've observed. We then, through the research at the University of Iowa, do a translation of those different raw scores into the standard score scale. And that standard score scale really becomes the backbone of what we do. That needs to be consistent in its interpretability, regardless of form or regardless of type of assessment you're giving. It needs to be consistent across grade levels. It needs to be consistent across time of year. So it's been built with all of those factors in mind. And then from that standard score, we link two additional scales. The national percentile rank, which is a description of how students did on the Iowa assessments as we seek a nationally representative group of individuals. And then linked to that is the grade equivalence. So you can see there's sort of this natural progression of these three scales, standard score, NPR, and grade equivalent, that means something as we look at growth in longitudinal data. So now the first one we're going to dig into is that standard score in greater detail. And I want to start by saying the underlying assumption behind the Iowa assessments and Iowa Flex is the next slide, that every student you face has a unique story. They've been through experiences, educational experiences, they've been through home experiences, but they're starting in extremely different places. I know we're structured around grades, we're structured around standards and so forth, but we also know that there are students well beyond and unfortunately well behind where we have students placed within a grade, within a classroom. And so the beauty of assessments that have vertical underlying scales, like the standard score scale, it allows us to find where that student is and understand where they're starting. So tied to this overall or overarching assumption is the next slide shows us that really there's two underlying assumptions. So finding that starting place, finding where that student is at a particular point in time in a classroom is really a positive attribute of the Iowa Assessment Scale. It describes with integrity, with stability, with reliability, where that student is at a particular point in time. And it allows users to interpret that scale, whether it be any of those three we've been talking about, but to describe where that student is. Then we also know that students take off and grow at different rates. Sometimes they're on an upward trajectory. All things are positive and the slope is high. We have other students that are plateauing at different places. We have other students that are showing a decrease. So we want to be able to measure each of those. So the difference between that starting place and where a student is at that next point in time is the growth. We're trying to say we can quantify this and we can help you interpret what that quantifiable number is between 0.1 and 0.2. So the quantification of that and the interpretation are really, again, those underlying assumptions. And this is very different than state level assessments. For instance, Every Student Succeeds Act assessments that tend to be very, very focused in grade at a particular point in time, serving a different accountability purpose in many, many ways, but not giving the same level of information that we're getting out of a test like the Iowa assessments. Okay, so the next slide just says the measurement of growth is really an underlying purpose that's served by the Iowa assessments and its complement, the Iowa Flex, that sort of is tuned in to where students are. Okay, so we're going to dig a little deeper into longitudinal by looking at this particular report. This is the student level report that's longitudinal, and there's also a group level, a cohort level that helps you aggregate this up. But just pulling this apart is part of what we want to do first. So this student profile is part of the handouts that Allison has posted here as a resource for today's session. So the next slide just pulls out a piece of it, pulls out the reading piece of it. And I think there are a few things that we want to be sure and understand what's going on here. So first, you might see two different lines on that graph. And there is a gray line, a muted gray line. That is the point that we think students should be at the minute you tested this student in grade 1 on August 8th of 2016. We knew that that student starting in August of grade 1, knowing nothing else about that student, we would have expected that student to start at that first bullet, that little gray bullet that's equal to the 1. However, when this test was given, this reading test was given to this student, they underperformed. So their black dot represented there again in that very first administration, they came in with a grade equivalent of kindergarten 0.3, and they came in with a national percentile rank of 4. So very low end, given that they were a grade 1 student. Now, as you follow that muted gray line across time, you'll see what we would have expected that student to do based on where they started in first grade. However, we can also lay on this the black line, which is this student's performance, this individual student who has been tested 5 times across 5 different falls, moving between August and December, but following that student's trajectory across 5 years in time. And the next slide helps us show sort of at that beginning, they were underperforming, right? They were less than, as designated by a national percentile rank of 4 or a national percentile rank of 20, they're under where you hope that student would be in their first grade experience, in their second grade experience. However, by the time they hit their third grade experience, you can see they have exceeded where that student might have been expected to be. They are now at a grade equivalent of 3.9 and a national percentile rank of 70. So they have much more positive slope between their grade 2 performance and their grade 3 performance. And I can look at this and look at the GEs and go, they change from a 1.5 to a 3.9. So significant change there. But then again, as they move to grade 4, more of a plateauing again. Okay, they came from a 3.9 down to a 3.7, a little bit of a downward slope for them before, again, in grade 5, going back up. You can sort of see, again, as they hug the gray line throughout these 5 years, sometimes they're above it, sometimes they're below it. And I think, again, those are good pieces of information for the individual teacher, educator to know about this particular student. The next slide, I think, just highlights thinking about points in time. They were in August. This school gave it in August, and then September, then October, November, December. They kept moving it back a little. Always pay attention to, again, what the period of time was, what they might have been expected across time. The expectation, again, as measured by this gray muted line, is triggered by that grade 1 entry point in August of their first grade year. And then it sets its points going out the next 4 years based on that trigger point. Now I can, again, I might have a student starting anywhere else. I could have this same first grader starting much lower or much higher than that, and I would still see that gray muted line across time because they were in first grade in August of their first grade year. And I would then again see where their observed performance, their black dot performance, is relative to that gray muted line across time. So if you're interested in setting goals for the individual child, understanding the relationship between the observed, the black dotted line, and what was expected in the gray dotted line are critical to setting the goals. Okay, if this child was underperforming in grades 1 and 2, I may not want that grade 3 to be that same gray line. I want grade 3 to exceed that. And in this case, that child did show in their performance in reading in grade 3 that they exceeded where I would have expected them to be in grade 3. So it's a lot to sort of pull apart. You can change the metrics on these reports, these longitudinal reports, to be the metrics that are most important to you. But again, just know that it is following where you would expect a student to be given where they are at a particular point in their academic career. The next report, which Allison has also posted for us, is that group. So here I've got an average test score across time. And so that average is just an aggregation up around these cohorts across time. Growth will tend to be a more stable estimate when I'm looking at a group profile, because sometimes I just have students that have a lot of sort of jumping around, and you can all imagine different students are experiencing different things at different rates. So they're not all in school 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There's a lot of other things. So group performance tends to be a more stable estimate of growth. So if you are setting goals for your classroom or the class as a cohort moves from one grade to the other, group performance helps you do that. I think with greater stability, greater sort of, you can rely on those scores more. If you're interested in setting individual scores, then using that information like we just looked at to really taking into account the bigger picture that you know about an individual student is always important. Okay, the next report shows us just one more aspect of how, again, if you're interested in the group level, these reports, again, that Allison has posted, allow us to look at two different things. They still have those metrics we were talking about with respect to growth. The expected and the estimated, okay, are the two that are coming into play here. And what happens then is that students are placed into one of three categories. They either exceeded that, they met it, meaning they hugged that little gray line all the way across, or they fell short in case they were under that gray line. So as I try to pull the information from those longitudinal reports into a summary report here, I've now classified that growth into three different sort of buckets for use locally. Again, those that fell short, those that exceeded, and those that hugged that gray line across time. So that report, I think the next slide is just a little bit more of a blow up of that report, allows us to then look, for instance, in that reading example, I had just 4 students out of this class. Now I have a limited number of students here that exceeded. So those students, that black line was above the gray line for the year that this summary report was generated. For those that fell below the red, I have 5 of those students that fell into that category. So this becomes a way for me to look at and evaluate. Obviously, I want more blue and green on this report than I want red. So I want to, again, set goals to minimize the red, to identify the students that fed into the red, and set goals for those students so that in the next time you generate this report, I am seeing more blue and green represented here. I think the next is just a blow up yet again, sorry, Allison, just to show again sort of how students feed into here the language and the ELA total. And students, as you know about the composite scores on ELA, they again sort of would have growth trajectories established for ELA by itself, language by itself, reading by itself, vocabulary by itself, so that you can really dig deeper into each of those. Or if you're trying to predict, for instance, to a state accountability measure, perhaps something more like the ELA total is what you're interested in looking at. So again, depending on what you're trying to pull from the Iowa assessments, and if you're trying to set goals locally, then looking at the individual tests is probably the most helpful. However, if you're trying to look forward to prediction or relationships to other sort of measures, then totals, composites, that sort of score is going to be more helpful to you as well. So students will be in different buckets depending on, again, because those are different growth trajectories for each of these. So again, going back to that assumption, there's a growth trajectory for every test, right? Because students are starting in different places, in different tests. We all know students that are strong in math and language is not their strength, or vice versa. We also know that students are, again, changing over time at very, very different rates. And so students are going in and out of there's sort of the accumulation in these pie charts in different ways across time. So the combination of the longitudinal report as well as this pie chart that summarizes a given point in time, I think provides a more rich picture of how a group of students are doing over time. The next 2 slides are just a demonstration of how students, again, sort of here, I have a different example. Same thing, the students' actual scores are here in the darker black line, and what we would have expected for the students starting out in grade 3 was that sort of smooth trajectory up, okay? And the next slide just shows for that same student. So this student would have been in grade 4, they did not meet. They would have gone into the red part of the pie chart. In grade 6, they did meet. So if I regenerated that reading example for grade 6, that same student would have been part of the blue part of the pie chart. This same student in grade 3 and in grade 5 was very, very close to that gray line, and they would have been counted in the green part of this pie chart. So just to show the relationship between the longitudinal reports and the summary reports that take into account estimated expected growth over time is, again, sort of I think it's bigger than either of the two as individual reports. Okay, so as
Kat,
we leave oh yes, please.
yes, sorry. There is a question related to that. If I can interrupt and ask. This is from an administrator, and they were wondering if a student performs better than is expected for a year, and she knows this is a controversial question, should that be accounted for because of the teacher? So like that growth from 4th to 5th grade, would we account that because of the teacher in the room?
Well, I think the teacher is always a contributing factor, absolutely, both positive and unfortunately negative. But I think we have to also, in this particular case, the teacher would know about this individual student and what they may have gone through between grade 4 and 5, and when sort of the point in time, was this post-COVID, was this during COVID, and so forth. So all kinds of contributing variables can be part of that sort of upward trajectory that we see here between 180 and 205.
Okay, thank you.
So that's the, yes, and Allison, just that's the sort of information that a lot of schools use as part of program evaluation. Or for instance, a change in curriculum, perhaps between grade 4 and grade 5 in reading. Anything that has been introduced, and whether the teacher was the sort of the person that facilitated those changes in a positive way, absolutely. I think that's part of a very positive conversation for teachers. As this student went from 5th to 6th grade, again, you might, did the student move into a middle school? Do we see changes across the board for this cohort as students move from 5 to 6? There's always sort of contributing, we've historically seen contributing factors from as students move out of elementary into middle and high school as well. So there's all kinds of contributing factors.
So Kathy, too, like what you're saying there, I would then think that is, again, where the group growth would probably be more helpful. Like
Yeah.
if you were looking to see if there was a curriculum, if the change in curriculum made a difference.
Absolutely. Then I would always say group growth is the way to go, rather than, this is the slide we're looking at here is just one individual and how they populate into that other pie chart report. But yes, group, if you're trying to better understand changes in curriculum, changes in how a cohort is struggling, and I want to get them back on track, those things are much better at the group level.
Great, thanks. I think that answered that question.
The next slide just sort of summarizes. Okay, so we've got standard score. We've got, it's broad, right? It goes from kindergarten through high school. It helps me track these things over time. And these added sort of interpretation pieces, expected and estimated, are part of that growth scale and the attributes. Okay, so we want to segue into the national percentile rank again, which we've mentioned before. So when I think about percentile ranks, I threw in a slide here. If anybody in the audience is a parent, the next slide shows something you proudly brought home as you took your child in for the first 2 years of their lives, and they were constantly being measured and weighed. And you would come home and say, oh, they're at the 95th percentile for height, and be so proud of that. Or you'd be worried that they were not growing enough, or so forth. So all of those things, that connection between a standard score, in this case, weight and height, those would be our equivalent of standard scores, and the relationship to that PR. Here we have in a national percentile, I've circled here sort of what those weights and lengths look like relative to percentile ranks. That's the same relationship we have in the Iowa assessment. So this next slide just shows this relationship again. Here I have 5 levels. That blue line is the 90th percentile. The purple line, level 1, is that 10th percentile. The one running through the middle is that 50th percentile. So I know, again, depending on where I started, if I started at the high in grade 3 at 213, I was at the 90th percentile. I then have a trajectory that has more of an arch. It goes higher. The slope is a little higher than if I started at the very low end of things, the 159, the child that started at the 10th percentile. This is what I would expect over time for that child. So what I want to do for that child that's at level 1 is break that trajectory, right? I want that 159 to go to the 184, to the 214. I want to break the trajectory for them. And therefore, every time I break that trajectory in grade 4, that 159 goes to something greater than 170, I'm going to count that as they've exceeded their expectations. If they go from 159 to 170, they have remained at the 10th percentile rank. And I can say they've maintained, they've sustained, but they have not grown beyond what I would have expected them to grow. The 159 to 170 is what I would have expected them to do between grade 3 and grade 4. So that's part of using the national percentile rank for growth measures. Again, the next slide just helps us better understand. It helps me look. So when my PR is going up, I'm growing beyond what I was expected to grow. When my PR is going down, I'm losing relative standing with my group. Now I know the IWAs provide national, they provide some group specific, but you locally coming up with your own PRs, coming up and understanding your own cohorts is really, really important to the percentile rank interpretation as well. And I know I started by saying this, I think it's an easy metric for families to understand. It's something that in the state of Iowa, for instance, we introduce the concept of percentile ranks in our Common Core 6th grade curriculum here. So it's something that students often understand as well. But helping to link PR to the standard score, I think is something we want to move towards over time. Okay, so the next slide, going to Allison, started by saying we had some changes as we looked at things nationally with COVID. And this is one example of a district that was very, very predictable in their performance. This is a PR of 75, 76, 74 for the 3 years leading into or prior to COVID. Then in the fall of 2020, they administered the IWAs. They fell to a PR 55. Well, as we all experienced, great significant decrease in performance. But the next slide, I think, helps show, okay, I see that. I can see the 74 down to 55. Yes, I understand that. And I understand I've just lost 19 points. But what I want to do is start looking 55 to 59, 59 to 64, 64 to 69, that I am showing significant growth across the next 3 years subsequent to COVID. And understanding that if they weren't changing, that 55 would remain 55 through 21, 22, 23. But rather, they're showing that they're coming back out of it. They are showing an increase across time post-COVID. So that's another way that percentile ranks can be used to monitor growth across time. Okay, the next 2 slides we've gone over before. I just want to say them one more time. I can use percentile ranks within a cohort. Like if I'm a 3rd grade teacher and every year my class is changing, I can look at my average PR every year of my class and understand change I'm seeing. Or if I'm a building administrator, a building person that's interested and responsible for tracing cohorts across time, I can use that same PR to go from 3rd grade to 4th grade to 5th grade and so forth, and better understand how that cohort is staying and performing across time. So again, that PR allows us to do that because of an attribute of the scale. Okay, I think the next 2 just sort of go over sort of some of the positives in normative comparisons. They are some of the easiest ways to measure real change in education. They've historically been used for that. And I think, again, the Iowa assessments are well positioned to help you locally better understand how you're coming out of a post-COVID era. So they provide a stable estimate for going forward. Okay. I think this just summarizes. Again, I guess the second point is I would always use national percentile ranks or any percentile rank as a complement to other things. Use it in addition to other things. And I think that's an important part of this. It gives a better, more complete picture that way. Okay, so I want to spend a little time now going forward to thinking about Iowa Flex and how I can use Flex as yet another variable in this really sort of sophisticated equation around students and student performance, it can give me more data points to think about. Okay, so moving forward, I think of Flex sort of as, and I think of all of assessment as sort of their bookending. You're defining locally, okay, I want to test in the spring every year, or I want to test in the fall every year, or I want to go pre-post, or I want to go within. You're setting those sort of bookends for yourself. And again, depending on the purpose, those bookends can move all over the place, right? You might be across multiple years. You might be across multiple times within a year. So we expand and contract our bookends to fit. We also customize them. We want to compare them to the right cohorts, to the right group of individuals at the right time. And so that allows us to, again, move in and out with these bookends as you plan for your testing. And it allows us to keep everything on the same scale, which is, I think, helpful in organizing and explaining things to parents and families and so forth. Okay, the next two slides just sort of go over, so within this bookended sort of what you're going to do for your assessment program, there's a program for K1 and I hope I'm saying that right, Allison. Yes, just kindergarten 1. That is part of the Iowa Flex program that is all about foundational skills. And the approach here is a little bit different, but it's really because we need our students to really demonstrate mastery of these very basic foundational skills before they move into dead-on reading and mathematics and so forth. So the approach here and growth here is measured through the accumulation of these skills. We want them to get to being a reader. We want them to get to understanding numbers and being able to describe numbers and so forth. So this is an adaptive approach that's done at stages. It's a multi-stage approach to testing these foundational skills. But the information reported here is more about proficient and mastery than really going and connecting to the rest of the scale with respect to Iowa Flex. So the next slide shows us for grades 2 to 8, then I can monitor using Iowa Flex within an academic year. It is an adaptive approach to testing. Again, I can put it within your state testing, for instance, or within other types of tests you have, or you can bookend it by the Iowa assessments, but it allows you to measure growth and change within a particular academic year, within mathematics or reading. So within that year, the next slide shows us, hey, I can start in the fall and I can get 2 metrics, the metrics we've been talking about, standard score, national percentile rank, at that starting point. And I can, through my selection of what goes into this, I can align what is going to be assessed in the fall through my knowledge of the instruction locally. And then I can give it again in the winter, and I can use those same 2 metrics to look at growth. And I again can measure given what I just taught. So that alignment is what has just been taught between fall and winter. And do it again in the spring, for instance, same metrics. And alignment is critical here because I'm trying to measure what I've just given the students the opportunity to learn in the classroom. And so I can look at growth there in winter back and spring back to understand sort of how the students responded to, how they incorporated what was just exposed to them in the classroom, okay? So that's sort of the within grade model. And the metrics, again, maybe the next slide shows us the metric for that 202 is that average standard score, and the 78 is a national percentile rank. Those same 2 metrics that allow me to place that student within that broader scale of the Iowa assessments. So that 202 has the exact same interpretation that it did when I gave the Iowa assessments, the full length mathematics test, for instance. So I can understand how these live together and explain to a parent or to a student what that means. I think the next slide maybe blows it up a little bit more for us. Yes. So that 201 and the 76 in this example are those same two metrics that we've been talking about. And again, what this sort of approach gives us is over on the right-hand side. And again, Allison has posted these as handouts, but to understand at that domain level, how this class was doing, this third grade class was doing on operations and algebraic thinking, or how they were doing on number and operations in base 10, and understanding what % of their students were struggling in that low category on operations and algebraic thinking, or in the middle category, or in the high category. And then in the center of this report, I can see how across all of the domains that have been selected, what this class is doing. So this allows me to look at my class as a whole and understand my average standard score after giving this in the spring of the year, is this particular one, but where they were. And in this case, I have very, very few students that are still at that level 1 and few students at level 2. I have most students that have migrated towards levels 4 and 5, that upper level of performance for mathematics in grade 3 for this example. So those, again, are just important pieces of information to use as I try to tie the Iowa Flex, the interim assessment idea with the sort of the bookended summative assessment. The next slide, I think, just shows, oh, maybe we can go by that one. Thank you. Is, again, I was trying to make bookends here, but I can think of bookends as just my Iowa Flex. I can think of bookends as just within my academic year and not worry about the Iowa assessments as summative. Or in the upcoming slides, I can sort of show the full model. But when I'm thinking about within, then I'm looking at change within a year. And I think some of this, if you go to the lower part of this report, you can see there's 3 points in time. Albert Einstein was our first student who went from 203 to 204 to 201. And so he registered a negative growth of, or a negative change of -2 on the scale. So the 203 and the 201. His performance was not ideal. He did not show change across the year. The third person down, Longfellow, did show some change across that year. But again, I can think about this and I can think about, well, what would I have expected? I might have expected a 4 to 5 point positive change between intervals, between fall and winter, and again, between winter and spring. So in this case, my -2, my -4, those are not where I had hoped them to be, even though, again, I had picked the domains, I'd picked the most appropriate part of the test to be given to the student at that time. And up above, the gains analysis again sort of generates the average standard score again across those 3 points in time, what's happening for this particular class. So again, I've bookended it here, so I'm interested in understanding performance change within the academic year. I think the next slide is, again, just another sort of the same student roster approach, given Iowa Flex within 3 times of year here, and you can see significant change, positive change for some students, negative change for other students. So the gain, sort of that column right in the middle, shows the amount of growth in the standard score, or in this case, for individuals, or you could have it for the group's average score from the spring to the fall. So this might be an easy way to then identify the students that I might pull back for additional mathematics education. I can identify which of those 3 they sort of was the most struggle for them. I can sort on students with the lowest gains to the highest gains. I can then come up with small group instruction for students appropriately. Some students will be ready to move on, others need to go back and review. The graph to the right then just shows along that continuum, sort of using those same color schemes, that sort of horizontally, sort of you can see the growth for those, sometimes positive, sometimes not so positive. And I think these reports allow you to click on those and become sort of more helpful to discern what that is telling you for a particular group of students. Okay, now I just want to put them together in the next few slides to better understand. I'm so sorry, this slide is Allison has also provided as a resource. It shows all of the 5 domains in mathematics. It shows those changes. You can sort of see the richness of information here. If I want to drill down here, I'm looking for students to move from the lowest to the middle to the highest. And sometimes the change is positive, sometimes it's not, but it allows you to help sort of dig deeper into a particular domain area. Okay, so how do I put it all together? The next slide sort of shows one approach where I might start with an Iowa assessment in the back to school. Again, that's going to give you an individual and group PRs and SSs, and I can use that to establish my growth goals for the year and to determine sort of what needs additional sort of planning, what's it telling you with respect to looking forward. And then if I went into the Iowa Flex, I can again know what I've just taught, for instance, in the first 10 weeks of the fall, and I can select those areas that match the instruction that I've been given, and I can give that assessment, and I can then evaluate that standard score relative to its starting point back in the back to school. And I can do that again in the mid-year, and I can do that again in the spring. And every time I do that, I can take a moment and sort my students again and think about what were the areas that change was positive, what were the areas where change was not positive, and reevaluate my goals again and think about instruction again. And I might go back and spend additional time just getting down some of the basics and re-giving that assessment again to better see if that instruction has had a positive impact. So this is sort of the big picture. The next few slides just sort of work off of the same thing. Here's a model that I might have back to school in the fall of 7th grade, and then use Iowa Flex throughout. And then I might come back in the fall of 8th grade and give it again as a back to school. So then I've been monitoring goals throughout within a year, and I've also been monitoring sort of change between 7th grade and 8th grade. I think this is most effective when you think about your standards that you're teaching, and when there's more of a continuum of standards across grades. It makes some of this interpretation easier. If you have very unique standards for particular grades, then you might expect very different things if they haven't seen them prior to 7th grade, and then they're seeing part of it late into the year. You might not see as much of a change. So your own knowledge of what's happening locally is very important to the interpretation of the results. The next slide just sort of helps us focus. I might be looking at, in this example, the green circle, the green oval shows me all of the Iowa Flex administrations. And this student went from a 60 to a 64 between fall and spring, which was a positive change. And so I may have changed at that time and thought, okay, the student's ready for more. And that student changed again in a positive way and had a 72 in the spring of that year. So very positive change for those students, for this particular student across those 3 points in time. If I wanted to add in sort of, the next slide shows us how I might just use the bookends at the end, sort of, or the back to school, the one summative. Again, I can look at that PR of 72. And in this case, that student changed by the next year, and they were at a PR of 65. Going back to what we were talking about, their standard score went up, right? They went from a 254 to a 260. So they did change. However, their change was less than you would have expected because they went from a PR of 72 when compared to 7th graders to a PR of 65 when compared to 8th graders. So their relative status within that cohort changed over time. but not as much as you would have hoped. Okay, so that's, again, just bringing these metrics back to the conversation. And the next one is just an all-encompass one. Sorry, too many circles, I fear. But I can start by thinking small. I can affect instruction at that sort of the gold circle. I can look across all Iowa Flex and understand what's going on there. But then I can also look at the bookends of the summatives and think, are they, so they're doing well within the curriculum that they're being exposed to. However, when I think about them relative to the nation, that gives a slightly different view of their change over time. And I think those are good competing sort of purposes. You want to know locally, you want them to be affected locally, and the Iowa Flex will help you see that change. The national comparison then again gives you a different perspective that is as important. It's just coming into it through a different lens. Okay, I know we're going to run out of time. The next 2 slides are just copies of, again, what Allison has posted for resources. And the last, I just want to spend 5 minutes on this. We can start again by looking at resources. There's 2 slides there that are just copies of resources. But again, thinking about this is a group level report and what we might be able to do with group in thinking about overall stability, precision, overall confidence for moving forward and planning. I think groups help us get there. So if I could go forward one more time, Allison, and maybe even one more time. There we go. This is just a scenario. And again, in June, we started down this path. I just want to share it in greater detail here because I think it's something locally that's very interpretable for your colleagues, for your educators to sit down and look at sort of your historical data and then use it, especially at the group level, for your planning going forward. So historical data gives you and helps you better understand, again, the consistency of what's been going on, and you can chunk it into whatever time periods make sense to you. This example is prior to COVID and then post-COVID, but I'm looking for trends. If you've been introducing new programs, if you have new teachers joining, if you've been reconfiguring your middle school and your elementary school, all of those variables are part of how you would go in and sort of bucket your historical data to better understand it. Okay, so those are important things for you to remember as you go into it. In this case, again, you can see the consistency between 18 and 19 prior to COVID and across grade levels, very, very consistent across grade levels. Some positive, slight increases between 18 and 19, but pretty much what you would expect. Now you add COVID, the next slide, I think, shows the difference between 19 and 20 a little bit better. And you can see those significant downshifts across all areas. And you can look and see, are all of my grades suffering the most? Well, we found in our state of Iowa that our 3rd graders suffered the most. And so they changed from an average PR of 65 to an average PR of 48. So that change of 17 PR points for the 3rd grade cohort was significant. When I think about it, more like 9, 10 points for the other grade levels. So the next slide then just shows me, again, I can then look at those 3rd graders as they were in 2018, how they did in 2019 as 4th graders, and then how did they as a cohort, when they hit COVID, do? They went from 71 to a 62, and then down again to a 54. So they were struggling as they went into 6th grade. They were not, as a cohort, making up time. They bottomed out at the 54 and then started back up the trajectory towards 59. But taking any of these and understanding where your students were in that 2020 year, and then as they moved buildings or moved configurations on your campus, bringing that to this conversation. So examining those groups of students across years. The next one, again, just shows that if you're interested in a particular curriculum, a particular set of standards that historically has been challenging for a given grade in your school, then thinking about them as a slice across Where here I know in 6th grade, those are changing cohorts, right? Different groups of students. But again, as the question asked earlier, if I knew the same teacher was in 6th grade all of these years, that's one thing. If I knew teachers were changing across these years, that's something else. So looking at that change within a grade is important. Okay, so there's a lot of different ways that I think as you sit down with educators and knowing your own situation, that you can reconfigure your data and look at your own growth charts and better understand what has changed and who's rebounding at what pace relative to others. Okay, so that's an important part of that. Okay, I just want to end on saying, again, growth, and maybe the next slide just helps us move forward. Growth is an important attribute, right? It can help us establish goals. It could be a goal to move PR points. It could be a growth goal to say, I want students to increase 10 standard score points across a year. And I can then translate that into, okay, I want to see a 5-point difference between fall and mid-year and another 5-point difference between mid-year and spring. It's a very tangible thing to do. And I can do that and monitor that in a very straightforward, the metric allows me to do that in a very straightforward, understandable way when I have everything on the same scale. Okay, so I will stop there and turn it back to Allison and Rita.
All right, thank you, Dr. Welch. Looking at the questions, there's one about the grade equivalent score. Can you explain how the grade equivalent score can show growth? I know you talked a lot about the NPR and the standard score, but the GE with that K.3 and the 1.5, kind of what that means and just how we would show that a student has grown.
It behaves the same way as a percentile rank, like my expectations. So when I'm thinking about expected growth, if I'm giving a test in the fall of 3rd grade, I would expect my students to be like a 3.1. Then if I give the IWAS assessments again in the fall of grade 4, I would expect them to be a 4.1. That equivalent, that change from 3.1 to 4.1 is considered a year of change on the grade equivalent scale. So if I give it at a 3.1 and a year later that student comes in at 1.5, that's a significant downshift. So I can look at that. And, you know, post-COVID, we heard a lot about loss of instruction with respect to months of the year. Even last week, there was another report put out saying we're months behind. The grade equivalent scale, think about that relative to months of instruction, that it goes from a given grade, like 3.1 to 3.9. Those are considered months of instruction. So what I expect is a full year, 3.1 to 4.1. But anything short of that, I have not sort of hit my growth goal. Anything beyond 4.1, I've exceeded my growth goal. So it's a very nice, straightforward metric as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that explains from that question, that year's worth of growth. I think it's perfect. And the 3 to 4, like that first number defining the year and then the second number defining months. And then Iowa Flex in particular, the difference between the kindergarten and 1st grade reports and it looks like the grades 2 through 8 reports. I know we showed,
we
showed the 2 through 8. Mm-hmm.
So that standard score and the PR really kick in grade 2. So thinking about growth from that vertical scale. The other, the K1 and 2 really gets at more of that proficiency. And I don't know, Allison, can you pull up a report from that? I don't think I have one in the slide deck.
True, I don't know the one here, but I can explain a little bit. It's gonna have I can statements So it's going to explain to the student, these are the skills that the student can do. These are the skills that they're ready to learn. These are where maybe some remediation would take place. So it's going to identify those standards and skills. So it really goes down to that standard level, more so than maybe the grades 2 through 8. So they do look a little bit different. All right, I don't see any other questions. And we are coming up on time. So did want to say thank you very much for joining us today. And we are, looks like just about out of time. So please stay tuned for our webinar next week. We're going to look at achievement data, scores, and reports that are supporting student learning and how data is being used to support lots of decisions, again, at the district, school, and classroom levels. So we're looking forward to that discussion. And for all of you joining us, how is longitudinal growth impacting the decisions that you are making at your district and your school levels? What scores are helping you determine program placement and classroom instructional scores? I'm thinking about the GE score, the standard score, and the NPR scores in particular. So share with us your success stories and how you're preparing for the new school year and practices that you have in place for reviewing the data in your schools, and tag us on social media and keep in touch. Is there anything else you want to add, Dr. Welch or Rita?
Thank you very much for being here.
Yes, and it was very informative. Thank you, Dr. Welch. It was great to learn a little bit more about using that longitudinal data and seeing that growth for students.
Thank you, and I appreciate it too, because I think you did a lot of great explanation with understanding those scores and how to use them for instructional purposes and district decisions. So thank you again to everyone who joined us. We hope to see you again for another webinar. And until next time, have a great rest of your day and have a fantastic week. Thank you so much.